Hello and welcome to Minter Dialogue, episode number 301. Today is Sunday the 4th of November 2018, and this interview with Jack Kreindler. Jack's a doctor, technologist and investor. He's also the founder of the Centre for Health and Human Performance based in London, as well as being the founder, chairman and chief medical officer of Sentrian, working to finally make remote patient management an affordable and effective reality for patients, payers and providers alike. Also of note, he's the co-founder of Weird and Wonderful, building bridges across life sciences and creative arts. In this sprawling conversation with Polymath Jack, we discuss how we can learn more about our own health and cure cancer, studying high performance and extreme athletes. We learn about how Jack manages and collaborates across large multi-disciplinary teams to pave trails, as well as what technologies excite him. Divinely intriguing. Welcome to the Minter Dialogue podcast, where we discuss branding and all things digital. I am Minter Dial, your host, and you'll find the show notes on my eponymous site, minterdial.com. Enjoy the show. Dr. Jack Kreindler, great to have you on the show. You are a fantastic example of being a phenomenal serial entrepreneur. You're a doctor. You also are a startupper, keen technologist, and you have an eye on the future for us, which is part of what we're going to be talking about today. Great to have you on the show, Jack. So tell us, in your own words, who you are, because you are a man of many things.
Well, first of all, Mint, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. And well, by way of background, I've been a qualified practicing physician and physiologist for 20 years and a geek for 30, paying my way through medical school, doing stuff in the world of computer science and mainly working in the kind of interface between machines and humans. So effectively, how is it that what we learn from data and analytics, how can we use that in our human world? So my first job, whilst I was still at medical school, was actually with Douglas Adams, the guy who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide, and I was responsible for designing the human computer interface for the first Wikipedia, which was hitchhikers.com, h2g2.com, as many people might have remembered. Ended up in the BBC, sadly, as opposed to becoming Wikipedia. But there you go. But it was incredible, and that kind of helped me understand how information technology was going to completely change the profession that I was going to embark on. And so I've spent the last 20 years effectively using information informatics, data science and technology to transform the very profession I trained in. And some people might say even disrupt it a little.
Surely. So what you are, really what I understood from what you're doing, especially in your primary role, is learning how top athletes, what you can learn from the way that their body works, that we can bring into people like me, normal people.
Well, Minter, that's you self-describing yourself as normal, which we would have to qualify. So, yes, I became very interested in human performance science, really ever since I became interested in climbing mountains and skiing down things that really we ought not to. What is it that helps people get up Everest and survive? Equally, what is it that helps a very sick cancer patient survive when otherwise you wouldn't expect them to, either surgery or long-term throughout arduous years of treatment? So 2007 I started my institute in London. This is not after a successful career in medicine. It was after many lucky exits in tech, in my tech stuff. And so the Centre for Health and Human Performance, which was founded in 2007, is now my medical home, and there we apply elite human performance science, the stuff that basically helps us get up Everest without oxygen and survive those surgeries, to not only help athletes, people like you, people like me, that are effectively in very high pressure environments as well. We're traveling a lot, we're thinking a lot, we're not sleeping enough, we're doing all of those things that are aging us rapidly. But the third category of people is in fact cancer patients. So we apply this human performance science, and a lot of the data that drives that helps us to adapt what we're doing continually, rather than just making an assumption and treating somebody for 5-10 years, and applying that to not only to athletes but also to people like you and me, right, and very sick cancer patients.
Right. So if I'm not Usain Bolt, and I have this very sophisticated, well-trained body that's able to perform at extreme levels, how do you transfer the body skills that he has per se, or the elements that have made him that kind of individual into the normal people?
Normal. Yeah, we are all normal. In fact, very normal people can also be surprised by how much they can do. If your profession is to run 100 meters very, very fast, you will appear to the rest of the world as abnormal or special or a superhuman. But in fact, it's not all down to genetics. It is also down to what you do with your body, how you fuel it, how you train it, how you rest it, how your mind approaches the world, and how your mind can sometimes muck things up with excessive stress and so on. So the real secret ingredients of elite sports science, elite sports performance, elite performance in general, it's not just about taking a superhuman. It's about looking at what we do with these apparent, X-Men, and helping people like you and me absolutely optimize for how we think, so how we manage stress, what we eat, how we build that into our bodies as substrates, and how we burn that as fuel, how we sleep and recover, and more importantly than probably all of those, if you're Usain Bolt, how you use the body physically to actually adapt to the environment that you're training in, that you're running through, that you're swimming across or climbing up.
All right, so in sports, one hears things like the top. What makes the difference between the very top playing in the Football League and the people in the lower ranks is their ability to get over mistakes. The difference between a number one, or Roger Federer, and the number 100 in the ATP is basically they had nothing to do technical, although we could argue that too. Yeah. How does one appropriate that into our lives then? What of the mentality, what are the things that we can partially at least bring into what we do? What kinds of discoveries have you got, and maybe tips you can give us?
It's a really interesting point. And in fact, I was just in Los Angeles the other day listening to an incredible speaker talking about the difference between, so-called super performers, super survivors, super beings, and the folk who basically, even despite knowing they've got to change, let's say their behaviors to do with their health, and they've got the data to do it, so they've got motivation, data, money, time, and everything. Why is it that some people are able to achieve things and some people aren't? And in fact, why are certain companies or governments or societies able to change things and others can't? And it's a really interesting point, which we know intuitively, but not many people have actually described explicitly. And that ultimately boils down to one thing: embracing failure. It is something that we do quite commonly when we're developing software, as we're expecting things to break to learn from it. We now, have agile software development methodologies where we chuck something out of the market, we see who likes it, who doesn't, we learn. We, in machine learning, for instance, absolutely relies on failure. So does the kid who's trying to learn how to walk with its neural network. And effectively, that's the difference, is that instead of kind of forcing people into a virtuous cycle of you've got to change, here's what you're doing, here's how great you are, here's sort of positive reinforcement and feedback, and in the real world we fail. And the problem with some of our behavioral kind of metaphors is that failure is something to be afraid of, to be ashamed of. And actually, the top performing teams, Formula One drivers, people like you who are successful, possibly people like me on occasion, is that we don't care about the shame of failing. We want to fail because we look at that as a point to learn from. And that, we know, is the ultimate thing that makes us succeed.
It makes me think of this notion of best practices. People in companies seeking to find the answer to the better results look over the shoulder, see other companies, oh, that's how they do it, or let's do the same. And yet really it should be actually best mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely. And you own, I mean, it's actually really clever because the best companies all look like they're stunning successes, when in fact you look under the surface of it and you realize what I don't want to say this on a podcast, but a cluster, you know what I'm going to say, a lot of the stuff is. And it's really the ability to survive through the failures that creates amazing companies. And I mean, we can name so many of them. For instance, perhaps one of the most interesting companies that I've seen come out of nothing was Headspace. Mm-hmm. I mean, it started off as an idea of Andy Puddicombe, the Englishman with his incredible voice. He's a dear friend of mine, and he started off effectively wanting to build some classes, some real, where he could spread the word about what he'd learned for 10 years in a temple, and want to take his robes off and teach everybody in classes, one-to-one.
Right.
That's not going to scale to become effectively the democratization and the ability to make the world a better place. And then but years of doing that and almost breaking, but persisting, adapting, learning, and then eventually finding that sweet spot. The folk that find the sweet spot without trying are absolute flukes. Everything else in nature pretty well relies on learning from failure, and enjoying the success without worrying about the next failure. In fact, waiting for it.
At some level, it's about the success through the failure, because then you've got the hard work. And thinking about Andy Puddicombe, another woman who does guided meditation is Monique Rhodes. These are Westerners bringing a lot of what I would call Eastern thinking to our world. It seems odd, with all the data that seems to be available, that we aren't all meditating. Do you, let's say, first of all, can you give us your slant on the benefits of meditation as part of the mindset shift and creating that good way of dealing with leadership in business? Do you validate that? And maybe do you have a statistic that you can help us out with on that, just to help the rationally minded people to get through and change?
I wish I were an expert on meditation. I'm not. Andy said to me, wake up, first thing you do, sit in the end of your bed and listen to my voice for 5 minutes.
There's Sam Harris, his Wake Up with Sam Harris. I don't know if his podcast, but he now does guided meditation as well. So in other words, if you want another choice, wake up with Sam Harris.
I mean, I'm waking up with all sorts of men throughout the week. I mean, you learn how to do it, obviously, without the guidance in the end. But neurologically, it's very important to try and reset your brain. And in fact, doing it earlier in the day before all of the issues build up, to actually get your mind to sort of work in a uncluttered way, and then clutter it more and more, rather than clutter it at the beginning and then try to undo it, is possibly the easiest thing. But, just going back to your point about Eastern thinking, if you think about some of those ancient symbols, it's not just about light and birds flying and things. I mean, you look at the kind of the symbol of yin and yang, for instance. The success or the light side doesn't exist without the dark side. Right. And I think meditation, if you want my sort of view on it, is not only about mindfulness and clearing the mind to be able to think, if you want to put it neurologically, to sort of disinhibit those barriers between different parts of the brain and let the brain flow, a little bit like how serotonin agonists and psychedelics appear to work, which is another whole podcast, indeed, I'm sure. But that's the whole point about it for me as well is having the mind in the right kind of space to be able to reflect. And reflection comes back to our earlier point about failure being a key to success. And reflection is something that we don't do a lot of. We don't do enough of. We perhaps did more of when, in the old days, the world believed in God or gods, and we sort of reflected on our good things and our bad things. We're superheroes now. We're millennial bubblists who believe that only right can happen. And I think that sometimes we can look back at some of these ancient ways of thinking to our advantage, both as individuals, but also, as organizations, whether it's a startup or it's a government.
My daughter asked me about confession the other day. Neither of us is worrying. I'm entirely atheistic otherwise. But it does seem that the opportunity to confess your sins, to be able to talk about your dark side, anyway, the things you've done wrong, is something that's more difficult in our perfect society. thinking of the individuals, because you obviously work with a lot of these high-performing athletes who are scaling incredible mountains and so on, or thinking about people in high leadership positions, oftentimes one will conclude that in order to get to the top, you have to be a dick. Or at least you have a bad side to you. The number of examples are legion about the bad side, the dark side of these individuals. From your experience looking at athletes and or top leaders, do you believe that you can be good and good?
I don't think you need to be a dick. I mean, I think that's one of the things which, we forgave, actually, especially in the 80s and 90s and maybe, until actually quite recently, that it was okay to just be an ass sometimes in order to succeed. And that is something that's never sat quite well with me. I think failure is different to negativity. There's a difference there. There is obviously a selfish side and a benevolent side to everybody. But I think in general that it is quite different from failure. You can by accident tread on people and end up making mistakes, making enemies, but that's not an excuse for not reflecting on it and to sort of repair those bonds and build relationships and so on. I think we live in a slightly different world. We have the Me Too memes and stuff. I think that is actually, those are all very, very good things. Those are steps for me towards a higher sort of state of collective consciousness, where it doesn't mean there are any fewer mistakes, but that I think in general there is fewer periods of purposeful darkness that we almost used to forgive especially in business.
At some level, there's this notion of intentionality. But if the intention says, well, all I'm trying to do is succeed, the way you get to the success, the intentions within the way, as opposed to the intention of the success, are important.
Yeah, I mean, the people are talking about this with things as far out as general artificial intelligence, as like the existential risk folk who are kind of saying, well, if you give a value function to a machine that doesn't care how it gets there, it just needs to make paper clips, as Nick Bostrom would say, it will do anything, including wiping out the planet, to make paper clips better and faster. So I actually think fundamentally we've got to look at what are the most collectively beneficial value functions when we're building, whether it's a company or a machine that does things, or whether it's our own life. It is really, really important, I think, to not just have a singular goal, but it's what you do in the process of getting to that goal that is very important. I mean, you can think about it. I mean, hey, this is like a very, very awesome podcast, but a very weird one, because we're talking about some heavy stuff here. Good. But, for instance, let's get water to everybody that possibly can, that we possibly can on the planet. And then we end up with a plastic crisis. So it's let's make things that make life easier for people. And then those things end up just causing junk. Let's travel. Let's make travel possible for everyone. Well, these are all fantastic things. And then we have more cars and producing CO2. And let's give everybody burgers, and we end up with methane. It's not a case of purposefully doing stuff, but we fail to reflect early enough. Mm-hmm. And then what we do is we backtrack after we've created industries that are apparently doing good according to those sort of endpoint values or goals that we have. So what can I say from that? Every athlete that has the ability to achieve amazing things is checking in on their progress an awful lot more often, looking at what's working and what's not. Exactly the same as if you're treating cancer. If your end goal is to eliminate the cancer, just blitz everything, you're going to get massive toxicity along the way, and you won't care for what's happening to the patient as much in between. But if we're in high frequency way, seeing what's happening to the patient. Is it working? Is it not? Are we failing? Are we succeeding? Just like developing software, we end up having more shots at goal, pivoting, persisting, all of that lovely juicy stuff. Less toxicity, better goals. That's the sort of the goal of the next generation of cancer and other complex disease therapies. The list goes on. It's a fundamental thing that we do very, very well in elite sport that we ought to look at and say, look, we achieve great things from this. Why don't we put it into other places throughout business and our own lives?
When you and I were talking before, I understood that athletes' body's ability to deal with extreme disease as well, or important diseases like cancer, their bodies may approach the disease better. I was wondering if you can comment on that, and also, there's a belief that I have that sometimes the way you are causes the diseases. And I wonder, because you work so much with cancer, to what extent, if I have malevolent thoughts, that can be part of how I get a cancer.
Well, I think, it's funny. One of my dearest mentors, he said once, I remember we walked in and to a clinic and a lady left the room, and he said, I haven't biopsied her yet, but this is cancer. And I said, why did you say that, Mr. Wilson? And he said, because she's a terribly nice person. And that was an interesting one. It's like somehow his engrams, after 40 years of practicing medicine, just knew something about possibly. And why is that, though? Why is it that, I've seen people who have malevolent thoughts who end up living till they're 100. I've seen people with negative, living generally for themselves and, living life to the full, sex, drugs, rock and roll, dying early, and vice versa. Great people who've ended up, getting cancer, and those who have just lived it great and done yoga and kale their whole lives. And guess what? They do great as well. So, everyone, and to be honest, my personal view on it is that I think these things are largely stochastic. I think that if you're going to smoke, you're going to have more toxins, you're more likely to get... I'm pretty practical about it. However, what I would say is that people that generally don't do stuff for themselves... don't do stuff for themselves, they do stuff for others, they often ignore signs early. Okay? So this is one thing. People who are extremely worried about stuff will tend to have one aspect, which is that they might not sleep well, their T-cell function will go down, they'll have less immune response to weird cells, fair enough, but also, on the other side, and there is some evidence for this that's been published, they will be more likely to be the people that will jump to the doctor and ask for a scan or a biopsy. So these things even out in the end. I think there are some things which are truly sort of neuroimmunological, where worry can cause problems and
or stress,
and that can affect the immunity and can affect inflammation. On the other hand, people who are very much one with the force will also be, possibly in a much better state where they've got lower cortisol levels. In general, they're sleeping and recovering better, but they might not be the kind of people that will bother people as much. And so if there is something that's just happened as a result of bad luck, they might not sort of bang on the door of their doctor saying, what the hell's this lump? So in answer to your question, I think it's a big old mess. and that is why it's kind of in most circumstances down to chance. All of those things sort of end up being spread around, the good and the bad and the ugly.
So presumably there's an element of putting chance on your side best you can.
Yeah, I think so. I think the fundamental thing, if you want to do well for yourself, is if talking about like the state of mind, is funnily enough to be in a good state of mind enough to sleep really well. I think that when I was at medical school, we got about half an hour's teaching on what sleep was, and yet we spend a third of our lives doing it. I think now with our sort of Matthew Walker's written this wonderful book that's now super top bestseller. You know what? Funny. I was browsing around on Amazon, and now there are several books about a guide to Matthew Walker's How to Sleep. I mean, there are books on the book already, and this has only just come out. I would recommend people read it because, not so much the headspace on its own, but in fact what it does to this fundamental part of your life. That is, by the way, another thing that we see all high-performing people do. They can either cope with a little bit of sleep or they protect their sleep meticulously. And I think that is a really, really highly connected part of how your head is working during the day, is how your head works at night, how your body works at night, and how it repairs itself.
Your words would rhyme beautifully with my professor of sleep at Yale. I was lucky enough to take 4 courses of sleep in the 80s at Yale. And we talked about the FSRs and the VFSRs back in those days because it was such a rare topic. These were famous sleep researchers and very famous sleep researchers like Bill Dement. So I'm 100% in favor of that. And I've been trying to get Walker on my podcast. Hopefully, if you're listening, come and talk to me. So listen, I want to just, while we can, Jack, talk about you do a lot of things. You founded a Sentrian, and also I have to bring it up, Weird and Wonderful, building bridges across life sciences and creative arts. So it strikes me very clearly that you are cross-disciplinary in pretty much everything you do. And in business, when you're doing AI or trying to do a new project, it also is so necessary to have a multidisciplinary team, usually not sociologists necessarily in business, but although I think there's a place for that. So with you working with so many different disciplines, how do you go about making that successful when you have so many different expertises in front of you?
Well, the greatest advice I never took was to focus. And I'm inherently cross-disciplinary, and I can't focus on only one thing because that's not where I flourish. And I think there's not enough mentoring, coaching, or training in this area. But I think the kind of interested in lots of things, able to absorb lots of things, and become a kind of a joiner of nodes, whether that's between groups of people or disciplines, in order to attack a problem like cancer research. We don't have, people like me don't have mentors per se, because there's not that many successful people who do too much, and it really is about doing too much but balancing it. So for me, the greatest success that I've seen is in joining dots, and it's where I do my best work. So the two sort of things that I've seen that are incredibly important to join together is the creative, even artistic thinking that comes from engineering and the arts, together with the kind of discipline that we have in science and medicine. And for me, if you're going to tackle really, really hard problems like currently untreatable cancers, glioblastomas, late stage anything, pancreatic, if you're going to tackle things like the diseases of aging, these complex systems problems there's never one thing that you can focus on because there's always 50 other things that are interacting with that. You have to take an interdisciplinary view of it. At very least, you have to take a multi-disciplinary collaborative view of it, even if it's not sort of cross-disciplinary, bringing in arts into it, for instance. But in order to attack those problems, my view is that you can't just take the credible people who have established themselves as incredibly focused researchers, pioneers of their particular one focused area. Those are what I call the credible people. If you're going to tackle these problems, you have to also hire incredible people. Non-credible. And non-credible, incredible, is that the same? But those people tend not to have spent 40 years becoming a professor in one area. They have skirted around a number of subjects, and they are dot joiners. And that's what I generally see myself as, is having a little. I mean, obviously, I've got quite a lot of subject area domain knowledge in my area of medicine, but the ability to draw in to that ideas from science, computer science, engineering, and even the way to communicate those things through the arts and communication type approaches. It requires those kinds of mixtures of skills, in my view, to crack really, really hard problems.
All right, so that's in the composition. What about as in the setup? When you're founding it, you're bringing the people in, and you're creating spaces for the opportunity to connect the dots. What kind of orientation do you give, or do you have, when you're trying to allow for this group of disparate expertises to concoct the solution that we're ultimately looking for?
I mean, apart from sending people off to Burning Man or something, which, by the way, I haven't been to, but I've been told might be a good idea one day. We should actually. That might be dangerous. But the way I do it is really just by the way I live, which is, dinners, for instance, where, you're joining these people together and actually you don't sort of plan it, but more you kind of roll the dice with the right kind of people. And this is why, some of this stuff really, if it's planned, it suddenly becomes functional, and then it kind of loses its spirit. But at the same time, I think you can build a bit of discipline into it. For instance, if you try too hard to isolate yourself amongst people that are doing all the same thing and reinforcing your brilliance, but also your biases, then you end up producing excellent focused stuff. But it might not be utterly groundbreaking. The real groundbreaking stuff is the sort of the Da Vincian approach of purposefully mixing up different disciplines. But that does just in general require a bit of serendipity, because you can't physically, merge, the Royal College of Music and the Royal Academy of Arts with DeepMind. You can. This is why we created this little fun thing called Weird and Wonderful, which is this loose collective of folk in science that believe that the arts are very important to them, whether it's photography or the fact that they're really brilliant speakers or storytellers, and it's those kinds of people that I think you need to add into the mix. It does not mean that you shouldn't have your deep subject matter experts, but you shouldn't isolate anybody. You should try as best you can to create environments in your work, in your startups, where you have oddballs who are all jamming together.
Well, it reminds me of the books in the late 19th century, which were considered thought experiments, which include H.G. Wells on the sci-fi level, but Turgenev as well, who was looking at how medicine could work out through a novel. I want to get to the last question, though, Jack, because time is what it is. You are at the cutting edge of a lot of things, including in medicine, but also tech. Which technologies are you most excited about today?
Can I give you one very, very quick general one and one kind of very specific one that I think... I think in general, the ability to more and more cheaply understand what is going on without invasively needing to do things in the body, I think is, so you call these like liquid biopsies or molecular profiling, these kinds of, in general, this kind of understanding what's going on, perhaps even in an individual cell or small number of cells, without having to go and find those cells and pick them. I find that really phenomenal. It's almost like remote sensing. So all of the technology that is not so much the things that are able for us to be able to do that, but do that with high accessibility, really cheaply for the world. So it's not just for billionaires, but for the billions, as my phrase goes. But that's something which I'm very excited about. And why? Because I genuinely think that if you can catch stuff early, you can cure it. And we weren't able to do that before. So that in general is fantastic, and that's due to
genetic testing is one of them.
It is, but that fundamentally is down to compute power. It's to do with how we analyze information and how we can fabricate the chip technologies to make those things possible. So that in general, and very specifically, and it also relates to that a little bit because it's about looking inside your body. I've most recently been fascinated about how a growing global infrastructure of ever cheaper magnetic resonance imaging machines, which have been able to, Nobel Prize winning stuff and everything, how MRI machines, with their limitations, can be turned into things which are even more powerful than we ever expected, just by tweaking the molecules that we squeeze inside our veins. For instance, glucose. There's a whole thing which I would recommend people look up because it will become the standard of cancer imaging in future, called hyperpolarized MRI. It is utterly fascinating, and it's a true 10x thing. In fact, it's a 10,000x thing to be able to increase the resolution of a standard MRI scanner 100,000 times by polarizing molecules inside glucose, which you squeeze into your body, which is completely non-toxic, is something which is utterly extraordinary. We will, for the first time, be able to see whether cancer treatment is working literally cell by cell the next day, rather than wait for 6 months and, sort of like twiddle our thumbs in the meantime. That stuff is utterly fascinating. It's an example of things that don't require a new infrastructure. It requires a magical tweak.
So I'm understanding that the MRI machines themselves are not that changed. They are functioning now with different elements within them. And the other thing I hear about MRIs, of course, is also the ability to send the results to be cheaply reviewed. Does that contribute to that element of being able to distribute analyses by different radiographers around the world? Does that contribute to this?
That's actually one of the things I started a few years ago, which was, can we help radiologists see things and learn more about what those things are they see on an MRI, and say, is it really worth sticking a needle in that thing where 97% of the time it comes back normal? And so using machine vision, computer vision, to be able to take those images, whether traditional ones or new ones that we're talking about before with hyperpolarized MRI, the use of machine learning to help radiologists see things they otherwise wouldn't is real magic that is happening today.
It sounds like spam. 97% of all emails are ending up in the spam bucket. But so Jack, I'll put all of that into the show notes with your help. How can someone follow you? What's the best way to get in touch with you or track down everything you're doing? Because it's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm often popping up at various conferences that very kindly,
including TEDx.
Yeah. I mean, it's it's lovely to be able to be invited to that. So there's a few things on Google and so on that you can look at, as far as and podcasts as well. I think just Google me and stuff will pop up. I think if anyone's in town and they want to come for a little tour of the Centre for Health and Human Performance, you're very, very welcome to. We're very friendly. It's not like a scary medical place. It's a lot of fun. There's always happy to have a coffee or end up doing a podcast with with folks. So it's pretty easy to find me.
I'll put your contact details, the best ones, in the show notes. Great to have you on the show, Jack. Thank you so much for everything you're doing.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for having listened to this recording of the Minter Dialogue Show. You'll find the show notes and other blog posts on minterdial.com. If you enjoyed the show, please like the handy Facebook button, or better yet, head over to iTunes to give a rating and review. But first, relax to Josh Sachs's Finger Paint.
Oh, fill me with all your colors, any different way to rid me of the gray and heal me with all your imperfections that you mention in your lack of self-security. Oh, I wouldn't care about the art form as long as you would feel warm, wrapped in canvas. Hold me tightly, slowly we would paint a lover's portrait with all your favorite shades, and we paint it with our fingers to show the world the way we feel. Oh, the way we feel. Oh, so messy. The ridges in our palms make colors blend and look ugly in the end, but they're pretty with all your favorite shades, and we paint it with our fingers to show the world the way we feel. Oh, I know, and all these limitations, oversaturation. Let me paint, oh, let me paint, oh, let me paint, oh, let me paint, and I paint a lover's portrait with all your favorite shades.